Maya Carter glanced at her watch, the silver hands ticking relentlessly forward. She was late. Again. The morning had been a whirlwind of calls and emails, each one demanding her attention. Now, all she needed was a ride to the conference that could shape the future of urban transportation. Her fingers hovered over her phone, the ride-hailing app open and ready. She tapped the Request Ride button, and the app sprang to life, showing a little car icon moving toward her location. Maya adjusted her navy blue blazer, smoothing out an imaginary wrinkle. The sharp lines of her outfit complemented her smooth, dark skin and neatly braided hair. Her style was deliberate, professional, yet approachable. She knew that as a black woman in a predominantly white industry, optics mattered. The car icon stopped a few blocks away. Then, without warning, the ride was canceled. Maya frowned. Her mind raced to rationalize it. Maybe the driver had an emergency. It happens. She took a deep breath and requested another ride. This time she watched as the driver's profile popped up. A middle-aged man named Tom with a 4.8 star rating. The car began approaching, and Maya picked up her leather briefcase, ready to step out. But just like before, the car stopped short of her location. The screen blinked. Ride canceled. Her lips tightened into a thin line. A familiar unease crept into her chest, but she shook it off. "It's just bad luck," she muttered under her breath. She tried again. Maya's composure slipped slightly as she stared at her phone, her thumb hovering over the app. She took a deep breath, telling herself that there were plenty of logical explanations for what had just happened. Maybe the drivers were stuck in traffic. Maybe they had personal emergencies, maybe. But the nagging thought refused to leave her alone. She tapped the app again. A new driver responded almost immediately. His name was Carlos, and his profile picture showed a smiling face. The car started moving toward her, and for a moment, she felt relief. "Third time's the charm," she muttered, clutching her briefcase tighter. As Carlos's car neared her location, Maya stepped closer to the curb, her heels clicking against the pavement. She scanned the street for his black sedan, her heart quickening as the car approached. But just as it entered her line of sight, the vehicle slowed, hesitated, and then the words flashed across her screen like a slap to the face. Maya's jaw tightened. She wasn't a stranger to inconveniences, but this felt different. Her mind raced back to other moments, times when shopkeepers had followed her around their stores, when colleagues had spoken over her in meetings, when strangers had clutched their purses tighter as she walked by. "Not again," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She tried to shake the thought to convince herself she was overreacting, but deep down, she knew. It wasn't the first time she'd felt the sting of being judged by the color of her skin, and it wouldn't be the last. Determined, she opened the app once more. Another driver responded. This time it was a woman named Lisa. "Maybe this one will stick," Maya thought, trying to inject some optimism into her frustration. Lisa's car began its approach, and Maya waited, her fingers drumming against the handle of her briefcase. But just as the car got close, Maya let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh and humorless. 3 drivers, 3 cancellations. The pattern was undeniable now. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text from her assistant, reminding her that the conference was starting soon. She was supposed to be delivering the keynote speech, the one she'd spent weeks preparing. But instead she was standing on a Manhattan sidewalk, fighting the urge to scream. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, one of the most influential voices in the transportation industry, struggling to secure something as basic as a ride. Maya glanced around, her eyes scanning the bustling street. People passed by without a second glance, lost in their own worlds. She felt invisible, yet hyper-visible all at once, a paradox she'd grown used to. She opened the app again, her fingers trembling slightly as she requested yet another ride. This time she didn't even bother watching the little car inch closer. She simply stared at the screen, waiting for the inevitable cancellation. It came, right on schedule. Maya closed her eyes, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. She wasn't just tired from the morning's chaos or the looming pressures of her job. She was tired of this, of having to prove herself over and over, of fighting battles that shouldn't exist in the first place. For a moment, she considered giving up and walking to the subway, but then she straightened her shoulders, her resolve hardening. No, she wasn't going to let this stop her, not today. She opened the app one more time, her determination shining through her frustration. If they didn't want to drive her, she'd make sure they regretted it. Tom Bradley drummed his fingers against the steering wheel, parked at the corner of 7th Avenue and 34th Street. The morning rush had been brutal, as always, but that was life in the city. He glanced at the ride-hailing app on his dashboard phone mount, waiting for his next passenger request to come through. The notification pinged, and he glanced at the screen. Maya Carter. Pickup location, 45th Street and Lexington. Destination, downtown Manhattan. Tom squinted at the profile picture that popped up. A professional-looking black woman with sharp features and piercing eyes. Something about her photo made him pause. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the Accept Ride button. Tom prided himself on being a good driver. He'd been doing this for nearly 5 years now, and his 4.8-star rating reflected the effort he put into making his passengers comfortable. But every once in a while he got a request that made him uneasy. "Trust your gut," he muttered under his breath, a phrase he'd heard his father say countless times when he was growing up. Tom couldn't explain exactly why Maya's profile triggered that gut feeling. Maybe it was the way she looked so serious, almost intimidating. Maybe it was the stories he'd read online about drivers getting into trouble with passengers. Or maybe it was something else, something he wasn't entirely ready to admit to himself. He tapped accept reluctantly, pulling into traffic and heading toward the pickup location. As he drove, his mind wandered. He thought about the last time he'd picked up a passenger who'd made him feel uneasy. A young black man with a hoodie, backpack slung low over one shoulder. Tom had spent the entire ride gripping the wheel, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds, convinced the guy was going to pull something. Of course, the kid had done nothing wrong. He'd thanked Tom politely and even left a tip, but the tension had lingered long after the ride was over. Tom exhaled sharply, trying to shake the memory. "It's not about her," he told himself. "It's about being safe. That's all." He turned onto Lexington and spotted Maya waiting by the curb. She stood tall, poised, her briefcase clutched in one hand. She looked professional, important even, but Tom's unease didn't fade. He slowed the car, his fingers tightening around the wheel. Then, at the last second, he tapped the cancel ride button and sped away. His heart raced as he merged back into traffic. He told himself he'd done the right thing, better safe than sorry. But as he drove, a gnawing guilt began to creep in. What if she'd really needed that ride? What if she was late for something important? "Not my problem," he muttered, trying to convince himself, but the words rang hollow. Tom parked a few blocks away, letting the app pair him with another passenger. But when the next request came in, it was her again, Maya Carter. He stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the accept button. This time, he didn't even try to justify it. He canceled the ride without a second thought. For the next hour, the pattern repeated itself. Maya's requests kept popping up, and each time Tom canceled without hesitation. He wasn't the only one. He knew other drivers were doing the same thing. It was a silent, unspoken decision, one that none of them would admit aloud. Tom tried to push the guilt aside, but it clung to him like a shadow. He thought about his own struggles, how hard it had been to make ends meet after his factory job was outsourced, how he'd turned to ride-hailing as a last resort. He thought about his family, his 2 kids who depended on him. He wasn't a bad guy, he told himself. He was just being cautious. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the whole truth. Maya finally managed to secure a ride after what felt like an eternity. The driver, a young man named Javier, had accepted her request without hesitation. When the car pulled up, Maya couldn't help but study his face, searching for any hint of discomfort or judgment. But Javier greeted her with a polite smile and opened the trunk to stow her briefcase. "Thank you," she said, sliding into the back seat. Her tone was clipped, her mind still reeling from the string of cancellations. The car merged into traffic and Maya leaned back against the seat, her thoughts racing. Her fingers drummed against her knee as she rehearsed her upcoming speech in her mind. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. She was supposed to be standing in front of some of the most powerful figures in the transportation industry, delivering a keynote on equity and accessibility. Yet she had just experienced firsthand the very discrimination she was fighting to dismantle. As the car approached the conference venue, Maya's frustration began to morph into something sharper, something closer to determination. "You'll regret this," she whispered under her breath, not to Javier, but to an unseen audience of those who had refused her. The conference was being held at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, an imposing building with sleek glass walls and a revolving entrance that never stopped spinning. The car pulled up to the curb, and Javier jumped out to open her door. "Thank you again," Maya said, her voice warmer this time. She handed him a generous tip before stepping onto the sidewalk. Inside, the lobby buzzed with activity. Men and women in suits milled about, their conversations a low hum of anticipation. Maya walked with purpose, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Heads turned as she passed, recognizing her immediately. "Maya Carter!" someone called out, rushing toward her. It was David Langston, the event organizer and one of her closest allies in the industry. "Maya, you made it," David said, relief evident in his voice. "We were starting to worry. Are you ready? Everyone's waiting for you upstairs." "Always," Maya replied, her smile sharp and confident. David led her to the elevator, and as the doors closed, Maya felt a surge of adrenaline. This was her stage, her moment to speak truth to power. Outside, Tom Bradley sat in his car a few blocks away, scrolling through the app as he waited for his next passenger. He had parked near the Grand Metropolitan, his usual spot for snagging high-paying fares from wealthy conference-goers. He glanced at the event banners outside the hotel, the words "Equity and Transportation, the road ahead" printed in bold letters. Tom snorted. The idea of equity and transportation felt like a joke, an empty slogan cooked up by people who had never sat in the driver's seat of a ride-hailing app. As he waited, his attention was drawn to the sight of a woman stepping out of a sleek black car in front of the hotel. She was tall, commanding, her navy blue blazer catching the morning light. Tom recognized her immediately. It was her, Maya Carter. His stomach dropped. He watched as she strode into the hotel, her presence so magnetic that even the doorman seemed momentarily awestruck. Tom couldn't look away. Something about the way she carried herself, so confident, so unshakable, made him feel small. Curiosity got the better of him. He pulled out his phone and Googled her name. The search results appeared in an instant, and Tom's heart sank as he read the headlines. Maya Carter, the face of change in urban transportation. Trailblazer Maya Carter pushes for equity in ride-hailing services. Meet the woman reshaping the future of transit. Tom clicked on one of the articles, skimming through the text. Maya Carter wasn't just anyone. She was a powerhouse, a senior executive for one of the largest transportation organizations in the country. She had spearheaded initiatives to address racial discrimination in ride-hailing services, advocating for stricter policies to hold drivers accountable for biased behavior. Tom's mouth went dry. Inside the conference hall, Maya stood at the podium, her voice steady and clear as she addressed the packed room. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "Today we're here to talk about equity in transportation, a topic that for far too long has been treated as an afterthought." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I could stand here and share statistics about the systemic barriers that marginalized communities face in accessing reliable transportation. I could talk about the policies we've implemented and the progress we've made. But instead, I want to share a personal story, something that happened to me just this morning." The room fell silent, every ear tuned to her. "As I was making my way here, I requested a ride through a popular app. Simple enough, right? Well, my request was canceled. Not once, not twice, but 4 times. And the reason? Let's not sugarcoat it. It was because I'm a black woman." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, but Maya held up a hand, commanding their attention. "This experience isn't unique to me. It's a reality that countless people face every day. And it's a reality we have the power to change." In the back of the room, Tom had slipped inside, drawn by a mix of guilt and morbid curiosity. He stood against the wall, his cap pulled low over his face as Maya's words washed over him. "We need to do better," she continued, her voice rising with conviction. "Not just as an industry, but as individuals. Prejudice, whether conscious or unconscious, has no place in the systems that connect our cities and our people." Tom felt a knot tighten in his chest. He thought about his excuses, his justifications. They all felt hollow now. The audience erupted into applause as Maya finished her speech, her presence commanding the room. She stepped down from the podium, greeted by a wave of handshakes and congratulations. Tom slipped out quietly, his head spinning. He didn't know what he would do next, but one thing was certain: he would never forget her. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the streets of Manhattan as Maya exited the Grand Metropolitan Hotel. The conference had been an undeniable success. Her speech had sparked animated discussions among policymakers and industry leaders, and several attendees had approached her afterward to express their commitment to making tangible changes. But as Maya stepped out into the crisp air, she felt a familiar weight settle over her, a quiet reminder that the battle was far from over. She walked to the curb and pulled out her phone to request another ride. Her fingers hovered over the app for a moment before she hesitated. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the street. A taxi was idling nearby, its driver leaning against the hood, scrolling through his phone. Maya smiled faintly and signaled to him. Some things, she thought, were simpler the old-fashioned way. As she climbed into the cab, she caught a glimpse of someone standing across the street, half hidden among the throngs of pedestrians. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face, but she recognized him instantly. It was the driver who had refused to pick her up. Maya's expression didn't falter. She met his gaze for a brief moment, just long enough for him to know that she had seen him. Then she turned away, her focus shifting back to the road ahead. On the opposite side of the street, Tom Bradley stood frozen, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. He had lingered outside the hotel long after Maya's speech, unable to bring himself to leave. He had listened to her words, each one landing like a stone in his chest. She wasn't just another passenger. She was a leader, a voice for change, a person who had worked tirelessly to make the system better, not just for herself, but for people like him too. Tom's mind replayed the moment she had looked at him from the cab. Her eyes had been calm, steady, and unyielding. She hadn't said a word, but the message was clear. She saw him. She saw everything. For the first time in years, Tom felt truly exposed. He thought about his kids, the lessons he wanted to teach them about fairness and kindness. He thought about his wife, who had always told him to be better, to do better. And he thought about Maya, who had every right to be angry, yet had carried herself with grace and strength. Tom exhaled deeply, his breath fogging in the cool air. He knew he couldn't undo what he had done, but maybe, just maybe, he could start making it right. He opened the ride-hailing app on his phone and stared at the driver profile screen. His thumb hovered over the deactivate account button. It would mean giving up his primary source of income, but it also felt like the first honest step he could take. After a long pause, he closed the app without making a decision. Not yet. Instead, he turned and walked away, blending into the crowd. As the cab sped toward her next destination, Maya gazed out the window, the city's skyline rolling past in a blur of glass and steel. She thought about the drivers who had canceled on her that morning, about the countless others who had faced similar experiences, and about the long road ahead. But she also thought about the people who had approached her after her speech, the ones who had promised to fight for change. And she thought about Javier, the young driver who had picked her up without hesitation. Maya smiled softly to herself. Change was slow, often painfully so, but it was possible. With that thought, she leaned back in her seat, her expression calm and resolute. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next.